Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight, before we hop into the stream, for those who are sending prayers or well wishes or anything like that, central to South Idaho, if you haven't looked at the news in the last 24 hours, is kind of on fire. The whole place. It's not one or two now. We had a lightning storm come across the state and it's not been pretty. So if you are a prayer person or positive visualization, don't pray for rain. That sounds weird, but don't do that. Focus on high humidities, very low winds. The rain, every time it comes in August, September, it brings lightning with it. So no rain, just high humidities and low to no wind. Let the firefighters get ahead of this. And I say that with a background in fighting fire. I've done it for a few years, so that's how we're looking at things. With that being said, we'll get back onto our topic, but just something to think about for the time being. Tonight on Occult and Crochet, we are going to go wandering back to a time that wasn't so pleasant. We're going to go look back and kind of tie up any loose ends about some witch trials in a certain location. But because of life being life, I haven't had a lot of time to work on my newest crochet project, so I figured I would show off one from before. This is a little hat, which is nice, but it's part two, or part of a set, and that goes with this particular shawl. And this shawl here, that's the bottom of it, of course. I had it laid out, and that's all it takes is to mess it up. But it is a very soft and fluffy shawl. But it's acrylic, so it's not going to be super heavy. It definitely will be warm, but it's not like massively warm. But it's a good little wrap, and it has a matching hat, which makes it a cute little set. And this is currently available on my website, and it is a one and only. I bought the yarn specifically to make the shawl, and I had extra to make the hat. So this is all that there is the one set. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out on my website, which is linked in the description down below. And otherwise, we'll hop on over to our topic. So we are going to go back to this, I guess you'd call it state, the vicinity of Trier in Germany. And our last topic of discussion, 2 weeks ago, was Peter Binsfield from the town of Binsfield. And he was the active hunter. He was kind of the face of the trials. But there was a man behind the scenes. There was a man who basically was the power behind Peter's insanity. And that person is the head bishop of that diocese, and his name was Johann von Schonenberg, or Johann the Seventh of Schonenberg. They like to use their last names as a town, apparently. I haven't looked into the linguistics of that, so if you know more about why they use last names like that, that's cool. Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, we'll press on forward. So, and I need to spend 10 minutes and just switch out my mouse. It's just something I haven't done yet, so every time I scroll down, it wants to go the other direction. Johann was born to a father who was a nobleman. And the nobleman's name was Johann von Schonenberg. His father, who shared the exact same name, so that's not confusing or anything, was a bailiff to 2 different territories, which was Kyleberg and Schonecken. And I tried to say those as close as possible, so I apologize. His mother was Elizabeth Weyer of Nickenik, which was also a noble bloodline. So the family lived in the Hartelstein Castle in the area of Eifel. E-I-F-E-L, so it could be Eiffel, but I'm assuming it's Eiffel. Johann was born into the noble family in a castle, in 1525. I couldn't find an exact month. Some people assumed it was May-ish, but again, that back in the day, it was a little bit harder to keep records. So, with being in a noble family from two noble lines, this is the family crest for the his father's side, the Schonenberg side, and I thought that was a pretty cool thing that still exists as far as roaming around on the internet, but it does exist. So there's that. Take that off screen. Not much is said about his young life. I'm gonna guess it was probably pretty comfortable with good education, since his family appears to have been well off. His history pops back into public domain around the age of 13, when in 1538 he became the domiciler at the Trier Cathedral. And tonight's synergy is the Peach Paradise, if you're interested. Again, not sponsored, just really good kombucha. So, a domiciler, or a canon, is a spiritual office within the Catholic Church. And I thought this was a little bit funny, but considering the time period, not that surprising. It is an honorary office in which, in a Protestant way, it appears to be a person of noble blood. That is a specific definition within the term that applies to the church for work. And with this noble status, and his family was from a line of nobility, knights, I believe, his family would also, or the person applying, would also be given a noble's salary. So this is something that you make a lot of money doing. These positions were not ordained positions. So while he didn't have to go to an ordination process, he could literally apply just because of his bloodline. They were, for the most part, status symbols. The spiritual princes, which is one of the more derogatory terms for them, could be applied. They had to have been confirmed, which is a level of spiritual agreement that follows baptism, or is the next step after a baptism. And they had to have tonsure. Now, no thanks on the tonsure, just straight up not interested in this one. I tried to find a quality picture of this kind of thing, and all I could find was random sketches, so I just chose not to use them. This is where they shave the hair around this section of the head, and only the top part, which leaves the monk's ring around the side. It's basically a furry halo is how I always think about them. And they have it like this for like a spiritual purpose. It's kind of like nothing blocks your access to God is kind of the definition. There wasn't a clear reason for why they did this, but that was one of the theories that's been put forward today. No thanks. I kind of like the fact that I've got this. So no tonsure for me. The domiciler could, because of his position, also wear the black cassock of the day, which was a priestly robe, and could be admitted into the cathedral chapel, which basically you oversaw the day-to-days of the church. You got paid very handsomely as a noble for that, but that was your purpose. Part of your purpose was to deal with all the mundane parts of the job. But from this position, Johann would then go on to study in Heidelberg and Freiburg im Breisgau between, and I probably messed that one up. Heidelberg I could figure out. The other one was like, I listened to it and my mouth doesn't work that way. But he would study there between 1546 and 1548. This would lead him to taking over the daily running of the local church in 1548, when he would become the cathedral canon. So domiciler up to cathedral canon. And there's a lot of these weird terms, and they're literally just different steps of administration within the church. You're not really a pastor or a priest at this point, but this is your position within the church. So good office secretary job. And at this point, once he became the cathedral canon, he kind of stepped into the active hands of the local bishop. and he could actually start to lead certain religious ceremonies and services as long as they were not of a highly spiritual nature. Now, each of these steps were little steps into Johann's exaltation into his final form, you could say. So, whoops. We'll just go back to using the clicky little keys. So this is where we really start accelerating things for Johann. In 1561, he would be appointed to a cathedral prebend in Munster, and this office is one that dealt primarily with wills and trusts, property, usually money left by a person's will to the local church. So from just a daily day-to-day operations to basically you're now an accountant for the church. Still going up, still moving into higher positions. In 1567, he would again be promoted to the cathedral custodian. And this is one more step above, moving him closer and closer to the bishop level. And this position was even held even more authority, as it included all updates and improvements to the church and all properties. So you understood from his last position where he kind of collected the money and figured out how to bank it, approve it, appoint it, appropriate it, things like that. Now he's the one calling the shots on what to do with the money. So he's moving up in the chain of command here. This was complete authority over the treasury and finances, balancing the books and things like that. And he also was the one who now could prepare for the larger services while the bishop would be praying and getting himself ready spiritually. Johann would be out setting up the altars, making sure the pews were in order, making sure the choir had the right songs, all of that kind of stuff. It was also given to this position to ring the bell for church services. And, I can go with that. You're going to make some noise and stuff like that. The part that was interesting to me is not always, but in a lot of your movies today and a lot of your stories today, you see the bell ringing done by a young acolyte. And it's kind of like the young kid that gets to go ring. But in reality, when you look at some of these time periods, ringing the primary bell as a call to worship was done by someone fairly high up in the church, because that was a sacred duty. It wasn't something frivolous for the youngsters. Not to mention when you realize how big some of those bells were and what kind of weight it would take to swing that thing to get it going, not likely done by children. But it's still a cool thought. So, onwards and upwards for our Johann, ever the mover and shaker. In 1570, Johann would become the cathedral provost. And I'm sorry, but how many levels before bishop do we really need? This is excessive to me. This is, again, a further upgrade. This one included how to dispose of or acquire property. So, not just taking care of the church and the lands around it, like the cemeteries and things like that. Now he gets to decide how to purchase and sell what the church already owns. This becomes important later, just as forewarned. He is also the voice of the cathedral chapter to go to the outside of the church, or to work up the chain. So people would come to him, he would talk to the bishop would talk to him, he would spread the word. And this was for everyday stuff. This wasn't specifically to spiritual things, because, can't have the peasantry speaking to the bishop. Like, heaven forbid the common person go talk to the boss. Yeah, I don't fly that way. Every job I've ever been at, I go talk to the boss myself. I don't want an intermediary. But, this is different time zones, different time periods. Apparently, Johann was doing a good job within the church itself, and he was headhunted for a position outside the church. Really good with administration, really good with money. And in 1580, the elector, which is kind of like a governor or a mayor of a province or state in Germany, I'm not sure. I looked it up, my brain's not catching it, I didn't write it down, so I apologize. But the elector Jacob von Eltz would elect Johann to the position of governor over Trier. This is a very important position. It was a secular job completely separate from the church, which is a little bit of a strange turn, in reality for Johann's life. But that turn would not be the only oddity that occurs here. That same year, and I personally think, this is not anything in the documentation, but this is a personal opinion, that he was offered this next position to lure Johann back into the clutches of the church, and he would be appointed to the head of the rectory of the local university, because the universities in the day, most of the time, were run by the churches of some form, mainly because they were the places where you could learn to read and write. Control the knowledge, you control the people. Kind of interesting how that works, isn't it? At this time, Johann was still not fully ordained. Heading for bishop, no ordination. That's special. So technically, if we're going to be honest here, he was just a lay person within the church. But that would soon change, because in the year of 1581, the month of July, he would be elected to the position of archbishop by his predecessor, and as archbishop he would also still hold his title of elector of Trier. So he is now the head of the church in the area, in this little state, and he's also the mayor/governor of said area. Nothing like mixing politics and religion to stir up some wild times and chaos, right, kids? This would lead to him being ordained to hold the bishop title into the priesthood. This was a local election of the archbishop that needed to be confirmed within the Vatican, and that confirmation would come in February of 1582, so he had to wait almost a half year to get his full confirmation, when Pope Gregory XIII would confirm the election, thus solidifying Johann's position and authority. This confirmation would come with the gift from the Pope, which this is just a side little tidbit here. It's kind of cool. The Pope's gift was called a pallium, and I couldn't find a decent picture, I don't think. Let me check. I know, horrible live stream coverage here. I thought I had everything loaded up, and I totally missed this one for some goofy reason. And I did not... Oh, that's special. Anyway, a pallium is basically a stole, the thing that they drape around their shoulders. This particular style is a width between 5 and 15 centimeters, or 1.5 to 5 inches for the royal measures, if you're going to go by that. And it was fairly long. The references that I could find to it were between 5 and 8 feet. Some were as long as 10. It depended on kind of how tall the priest was, because it draped around their neck, and some would actually wear it almost as a scarf. It was always cream or white in color, and it had, the pallium specifically, had 6 black equal-armed crosses embroidered, and it had to be in black silk thread. Talk about ritzy and fancy here. Following the receipt of the stole, so Johann received his gift, he would be consecrated by Giovanni Lodovico Madruza later that year in August of 1582 at the Diet of Augsburg. So he had to wait a full year for his full position and authority to basically be instilled, granted, however you want to look at that. But he was given a position, confirmed, but the full-fledged consecration to the position, which had to be done by a priest, the Pope wasn't traveling, but another priest came through and finalized, and I'm assuming Giovanni would actually be a cardinal. I looked him up. For being in a situation where his name is going down in history as part of Trier's excitement, not much is said about him that I could find, which, again, kind of strange. But so we talk about the Diet of Augsburg, and this is not a food ration of some form, contrary to popular belief, which I thought it was when I was like, diet, is this like some kind of meal, party, celebration? What is this? It is a deliberative body, but not a legislative one. so philosophers joining to have a chit-chat, a meeting mainly of religious leaders, but it also would include political leaders as well as noble classes. If you're important and you might have an opinion or a theory, you're probably welcomed to these things. They were held in this part of Germany for many years before this and many years after this. The particular one of Augsburg took place, the first one that I could find a reference for was in 1282, and then there were there were blips of other diets through the years. I believe there was like 15 or 20 total of them. They're not important. This isn't important to the story. It's just some trivia side notes. But they were these little meetings that would come, and they would propose ideas, kind of formulate plans. From the diets, they would go to like councils, and from the councils, it would go to the Vatican itself. So these were kind of step one meetings in big religious and, let's be honest here, political changes that would have to be approved going up the chain from the Vatican and the papacy to return back down. So these were not minor events, and for him to be consecrated at one of them was a gigantic bell to the community, clarion bell, that this was an important person and now he's in charge. This does not go the way people would think today. This is a very, very bad thing. Now that Johann, with his odd little haircut, was in charge in a exceptionally powerful and dangerous way, this is just another fun fact. Didn't realize that this was such a controversial thing back in the day. He was the first one who would force implement the Gregorian calendar system in the area. And that was one of the first things he did within the first few days of him being in office, is what it looks like. And the Gregorian calendar is the modern one we use today. So we have months delineated between 28 days and 31 days. There's 12 months in a year. Every fourth year we have a 29th day month. So he was the one who implemented that in this area. And as I was kind of poking around in that, the switch from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar back in the day, ooh boy, there were some fights over that. But yeah, that was one of his first acts. Just random tidbit. Johann would be a tireless fighter against the Reformation that was occurring within the church. Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and all his 92 Theses, and a whole bunch of the Waldenses, and all these people were fighting against the authority of the church. Justified. And he was a big fan of this little group I talked about last time, and I will go over them eventually. I need to do some serious research into them because I know this much, and there's this much to go. So, and that is the Jesuit order. He would force people, of course he would, to this line of thought that the Jesuits were the good guys and that the church held all authority over a person's soul. He would push together all people under the very strict principles of the Council of Trent. Diet, Council, Vatican. So Council of Trent is kind of important at this time. Some of the things that he enforced under the Council of Trent was the abolition of abuses. So he took out the abuses, supposedly, in the indulgence system, where you paid to get someone out of purgatory or save them from hell by paying to the church so that they would pray for a person. Because that's how prayer works. More seminaries for training of pastors and priests under the very careful tutelage of the Jesuits, of course. And establishing the compulsory formalities for marriage. And that was a lot of wording to say this is where you have the marriage performed strictly by a priest, no longer justice of the peace, priest only, and you had to have a presence of 2 witnesses. Today we still have the 2 witness thing, but you can go back to the justice of the peace and have it done there too. But this is where a lot of that became implemented, was during, or at least in Germany, during this time. There were some other things that came out about the council that Johann would push. The Council of Trent is one of the bigger policy makers, you might call it, in the day. I know better than to use my mouse. Confessionals would be installed in every chapel, so you had a little bit more privacy when telling the priest your sins, because, again, if you go by the actual Bible of Christianity, when Jesus the Christ came to free us from our sins, he became the intermediary. We talked to him directly, but not within this particular domain. Again, you do you if that's what you want, but this is one of those things where you scratch your head going, I thought you guys followed. Okay. The high altars, which are those immaculate, beautiful things, and trying to get a good picture of them that was not copyrighted or watermarked or whatever was a little difficult, so I didn't get a good one of those, would be centrally focused. So instead of off to the side, because if you look at some of the old descriptions and paintings and stuff, you'd have like a choir room on one side, you'd have the altar on the other side in the corner. He brought it back to center stage, which is how most of them are set up today. And the choir, which had been separated primarily from being able to see, would be now opened up to forced to see the altar, sometimes sitting behind it, sometimes off to the side, but now they were forced to look at the altar as well, which is fine. That I don't have an issue with. Oddly enough, the high altar would also be the new storage place for the sacraments. And this, I was like, where'd you put them before? Apparently, they used to be stored strictly within the priest or bishop's home, and this was a way to keep things more centralized so that they were always available for whatever purpose was needed within the church. They also added benches, what we would today call more than likely we would call them pews, and they were standardized. So not one church had one style, one church had another, they all had the same style. And they were trying to prioritize sermons and lessons for churchgoers. And if you had proper seating, that meant you were sitting up and paying attention, not standing around or leaning or bring your own chair. Everything was kind of being standardized. That's fine. Again, these were some of the odd things that came out of the Council of Trent that weren't as weird. Get my mouse to move here. Oops, too far. Johann would also start to implement mandatory confessions for each and every member of the clergy and worker within the church. And as such, you were also required, per Archbishop Johann, to offer an oath of obedience to the Pope, which also is per the council in 1564. He would also enforce a list of prohibited books that were mandated specifically by the Vatican, and he would also order that every citizen of the area follow the Roman Catechism, which would unify all masses into one style of Latin liturgy. So this is our way, there's no other option, don't think for yourself, do what you're told. Matter of fact, Johann would also be one of the first to publish the Catechism for his diocese in 1589. We're getting closer to why I'm talking about him. This is a lot of filler background, but it's giving you the foundation and how he ended up with the authority for what he did, and also the people he was tied to as to why he did what he did. This publication was specifically for people within his archdiocese realm, and he would bring in popular missions, which would be used to inflame the hearts of the congregation back to the church's authority. Popular missions were basically little evangelistic series where you would call all the people who had membership in the church. Today we would send them an email or make a phone call. Back in the day you'd send runners and collect them all. We're doing this cool thing, you gotta come check it out, and fire up the people to invite their neighbors, join the church, don't worship Odin, that kind of thing. So now we're into why I have him in this discussion. Overall, he's kind of a boring character. There's not much going on before this. His rise to power seems a little bit scripted in some ways, which could be just the way history has been written, but it's a little interesting how he just kind of fell into some of these positions. But now we're into the heart of it. The elector governor, who is the one of the country of Germany, is the way it sounded, or his senior in office, if we're talking just about Trier, was basically uninterested with his fight against Reformation. Wasn't a big religious guy. He believed in the church, but it's like, calm down. You guys are pushing stuff a little bit too much, so enough. And this was a man of law and reason by the name of Dietrich Flade. We talked about him before, but we're going to bring him back in because he also plays a part in this story. Dietrich's more analytical mind would not set well with the hyper-zealous aspects of Johann. Johann was on fire for the church and combating all forms of what he would see as heresy. Okay, but why are you involving the politics into this? Well, that's where we keep politics and religion separate, because bad things happen. During this particular time period, the 1550s to about 1610 or so, this was a great period of unrest and hunger. Crop failures were a very typical thing. It happens if you look at historical patterns. It's called weather changing, and it changes every 50 to 100 years. There's a little cycle shift. This was a cycle shift, and people weren't prepared for it. And agriculture was a thing, but if you didn't know how to mitigate it, and they didn't have like sprinkler lines like we have today to water your crops, so things, your well dried up, your stream that you fed, flood irrigated with dried up, you're SOL. And that's where a lot was going on here. Because of the crop failures, disease and plagues started to crop up, as it does when you don't have water to be clean with. And there was also a war going on in another part of the country, and this was a fear thing for the people there. They didn't want the war coming to them. And I was digging around, that war was in another country, but that didn't mean it didn't affect the people in Trier. So all of these things, the crop failures, the famine, the plagues, the rumor of war, these were things that led to the fomentation of hate towards those who were not of the church, those who were odd, those who were unique. Thus, the witch hunts and trials of Trier began. Thanks to the highly aggressive nature of Johann and his overly mad auxiliary bishop, Peter Binsfeld, who we spoke about before, spit on his name and may he rest in hell, Dietrich himself would find himself on the wrong side of this debate. Johann had whipped the population into a frenzy with his anti-Reformation zeal, and Peter was out being his good little hunting dog, and anyone who was a nonconformist was deemed a witch. Dietrich became a victim of this because he wanted to slow the roll, temper all of that fire and zeal of religious fanaticism with some logic and reason, like common sense. And he even issued various decrees trying to slow and calm down the fervor of the church of the day. He wanted to stop interrogation of witches and put an end to the mock trials, because they were a joke. If you ever get the chance to read some of the translated texts of these trials, you read the real trials and then you read what was going on during the witch hunts. Mock trial is the only way to describe that. It was a joke. And let's be clear, once fear of one's soul and religious zealotry have infected a populace, there's not another word, it is an infection, it is a disease. There is no hope of recovery without very drastic circumstances. You have to destroy the heart of the zealotry and the person fomenting it. But how do you stop this level of insanity? You can look around today and tell me if that's going on, because it is in parts of the world, don't get me wrong. But how would you stop it? If you really could see this as a physical thing where people were so scared for their very souls that they would do anything to please that religious leader, how do you stop that? And I asked that an honest question because I've thought about this as I was researching. How would you stop this? It's not an easy answer. Thankfully, fate has a way of slowing down madness in its own way. Johann, after all of the chaos that Peter was creating, would fall ill in 1594. Oh, poor boo-boo. And so ill that he actually requested a coadjudicator, which is an assistant bishop used when the current bishop is not able to complete the tasks assigned. And his coadjudicator was Lothar von Metternich. Lothar von Metternich, I dug some into him. Not really a big witch hunter dude, not really big fan of that. Not a lot is written about him. Seems like he was kind of more, I'm going to stay cloistered up in the church. You guys can do your chaos out there. Not interested. And a few years after his appointment of Lothar von Metternich to the adjudicator position, Johann would succumb to his illnesses and pass into the abyss on May 1st of 1599. There was an altar placed on his grave in 1602. It was redesigned again in 1730 into what you can see today if you go there. It is nestled in, where'd it go? There we go. This is the cathedral that houses his tomb, and there's a sacred altar built onto the tomb, which I guess was a thing back in the day. It's a little creepy to me, but that is what they were doing. So there's that. This is where I could end this right now. Well, I'm not going to because there's some things I want to tie up, some loose ends. We went over the two most prominent people in the witch trials of Trier, and I want to go over a little bit of a preview or an overview of what was actually happening in Trier and the basics of why these witch trials were even taking place, because it seems a little bit illogical as to why, and they only went on for a couple of years, well, decade or so. Just a reminder, this is the area we're talking about. This beautiful scenery, this is the official city of Trier, the capital of the state area, and I looked up some of the smaller towns. The entire area is this beautiful rolling landscape, cities along the river. There are some very, and I didn't realize this, Roman-influenced buildings. There's several bridges still in use today that were built by the Roman legions who helped come in and spread everything there. So this has a very rich historical significance to the church and to just how far the Roman culture before Italy and the modern day version of it had actually spread. So back over here. So the main bulk of the Trier witch trials would begin in 1581. Funny, that's when Peter and Johann stepped into their full power. Ironic how that works. And on paper, they would officially end in 1593, when Johann didn't have his authority anymore and our dear sweet Peter was getting the bubonic plague and had, infestations of boils all over his skin. But did they really end right there? Can you just turn off zealotry like this with a switch? They kind of faded into nothingness. It was not a quick finalization here. So as I stated earlier, Johann really liked the Jesuits and their powerful belief in the complete authority of the church. And like I said, I want to do more deep dive into this because there's a lot about the Jesuits that makes no sense as a court and how it ties into the church. It's a really odd little combo, but we'll discuss that later. Because of this particular belief in the strict authority of this church in particular, which was backed really weirdly by a very powerful political structure, this led to extremely dark. These ones are laid out very clearly in all the documentation and information about Trier specifically, but if you look at the entirety of the witch trials, these three in particular and one additional one were the primary targets across the board. Basic three were the Protestants, the Jews, and witches. Protestants were basically defined as any non-Catholic sect of Christianity. the Jews, self-explanatory there. And witches in this sense is a catch-all. There's not a specific group. It wasn't like the Wiccans of today who have their small covens with their altars and they're worshiping Gaia or Diana or whoever. This was anyone who is a nonconformist. You didn't bend the knee, didn't kiss the ring of the Pope. These were non-Christians. So you didn't believe in any of the other churches either, so you must be bad. There were also included natural healers, single mothers, and don't ask me why they threw that in this mix, but that's what they did. Polygamous. People who sleep around a lot. I just completely lost the name. But you've got a lot of these people who they just didn't conform to what was the normal or church authorities blessed lifestyles. Under this craze, specifically in Trier, if you didn't go to church, you could be condemned as a witch. If you didn't kiss the ring of the bishop, you could be condemned as a witch. If you made an herbal tea to deal with a belly ache, you could be condemned as a witch. If you just happened to be born into the wrong bloodline, you could be condemned as a witch. These were exceptionally horrible and dark times. The fervor of the hunt was not kept only to the poor. Oh, no. Judges, mayors, lawyers, other pastors and priests even, and even the deans and leaders of the university were all up on the chopping block. Bend the knee or burn. No questions. During this time, on paper officially, over 350 people were burned alive. Over 22 villages within the state-ish area of Trier were decimated. There were 2 villages in particular that are referenced in a lot of the historical documents that I could find. And these 2 villages in particular were unique because after this madness was over, there was only 1 female resident per town. Think about that. And notice I didn't say a woman. I said female inhabitant because the reference does not specify that this was an adult. It is implied that this was a young child. These people were so sick, so depraved, so terrified by the way the church was pushing them. Let me rephrase. Archbishop Johann was pushing them. Peter Binsfield, his bloodthirsty bull, I won't continue that, they would annihilate entire villages except for a handful of people. Men were not exempted. Children were not exempted. Women were the biggest thing they went after. They would hunt men, women, and even children in their bloodthirsty rage and offer them all to the flames. These people are insane. Religious fervor to this level is dangerous, and I don't care what religion you're in. A third of the people in the official documentation were of noble status. So of those over 350 people, a minimum of 100 of them were nobles. These were leaders in their communities. They were elector governors. For example, Dietrich Flade. He doubted the confessions under torture were valid. Duh. Today that's the theory of duh. Back in the day that was heresy. He wanted to bring law and order and reason with logic to the issues of the day. And by all that is holy, that made him an enemy of the church. Him wanting to use logic, not put people in thumb screws, jam bamboo spikes up their fingernails. That was Chinese, but those type of things, the rack, stretching them, breaking their bones to get a confession, he deemed that as that wasn't a confession, that was torture to get an answer. They never come true like that. He was deemed an enemy of the church. He was deemed a witch because he wanted to use logic and reason to stop this nonsense. Again, this stuff makes me crazy. And just so we're clear, that 350, as I said before, is only the official number on paper. Those were people that were in the records of the bigger towns within this area. There is a theory, and judging by the way the stories have come up, the historical record of entire towns being wiped out, that number is going to be significantly higher. Not all of the people who were hunted and executed were taken into the city courts or churches at front yards. You'd be surprised how many of these people actually were burned at the stake in front of the church. Think about that. We are loving people, but we're going to burn you in front of the church because you don't believe what we believe. No. People were very, very prominently, because of the fear-mongering and the fear that was spreading like a virus, were being tried by their neighbors, not in a court of law, by a lynch mob, and they'd be offed without a judge or a church official. Therefore, their death wasn't recorded. All of a sudden, there's property available. Funny how that works. And it is suspected that the number in this area could be well over 1,000 souls that had been lost to the treachery and the zealotry of the church and its fear-mongering bullcrap. Sorry, but that's how I feel about it. This was back in the day, mind you. Things have changed today, and there's been apologies made, but that doesn't bring these people back. It doesn't vindicate the people who were taken out. It doesn't condemn the monsters that committed these atrocities. That's what we're doing here, is we're reminding people that there's things in the past you need to remember and don't let it happen again. And I want to be clear, very clear. The people that were being hunted were, I'm going to say 99% honest on this, were not witches. They never cast a spell in their life. They were peaceful people living their lives, just not in the church. That is what was going on here. The church was using the cycle of drought that led to crop failure and famine to say that the devil walked the land. They used the illnesses and random death, just because death happens. It's part of how we live here. Like, I'm sure everyone who's watching this hasn't known at least one person who died. That does not mean that the devil's roaming the planet. It is, but that's a different story. But they would use those deaths and those illnesses to prove that the devil was alive and active in the area of Trier. This provoked an already beaten down population, an already exhausted population, and an already terrified population to levels of insanity that is only seen in times like this. Johann and his cronies would stir up the people to drive out the devil from their land and bring back the rain. It's not quite how that works. Once accused, almost no one escaped the flames. If you were accused, your death was pretty much assured within 48 hours to 3 months, depending on how quick the trials could get to you. You were up against inquisitors, notaries, corrupted judges, the priesthood, accusers of all forms, and law enforcement. You were one person. Most of those people, unfortunately, had medial education. Some of them can read or write, but were you versed in the law? Were you versed in the Bible? Not as much as you would think. They weren't stupid, but the church kept their cards up against their chest, and law was reserved for political leaders. It wasn't something that you discussed over the dinner table like we can do today. Torture would follow, demanding a confession. And I mean tortures that I have not talked about on here, and I'm not sure if I will do a video. I'm trying to decide on that, because this is a time period where torture was perfected, and it's not pleasant. And even if you could withstand the torture, because some people could, which is horrifying when you realize that, they would claim your lack of a confession was a confession. Fear does crazy things to people's minds, and it damns you for it. Like I said, this is insanity, and this is why I want to talk about it. Is it needs to be reminded, because the same type of fervency still is going on today around the world. Don't fall for it. Stay out of it. Logic and reason. Look at the facts. Just because some talking person, church leader, political leader, newscaster, whatever it is, just because they're blabbing their little mouths doesn't mean it's true. Remember that. Once accused, no one got away. And what's really suspicious about all of this, there's some little things here that definitely make you want to go, that's interesting. Why is that happening? Innkeepers, said notaries, copyists, your journalists of the day, and accountants grew wealthier by the day. The church's authority grew to nightmarish authoritarian levels, and the executioners came so wealthy they would wear gold and silver and ride upon noble horses that, they took from the stables of the noblemen that they had hunted and executed. The executioners' wives, who generally were not special, executioners were before this hated, suddenly started wearing jewels and gems and wearing all sorts of fancy clothes. Of course they did. The children of the executed were exiled. How in the hell could these people sleep at night? Execute the parents for witchcraft, of all stupid things, and then banish the kids to the forests, where they would more than likely find death. And if they didn't kick them out of town, they would look for a way to say that the kids were witches too. Don't have words. Yeah, the devil did walk the land in Trier, but it wasn't who you thought. The devil walked the land in Trier dressed in black robes or white cassocks. They had shaved heads and carried a book they didn't believe in. Goods were confiscated by the state and the church. They took out those who were knowledgeable in husbandry, horse husbandry, cattle husbandry, breeding animals, farming and vinting, those who make the land produce and make wine, which was a very big thing in Trier at the time. The land became even more sterile and unmanageable during these times. It got to the point where nothing was alive. A war would have caused less devastation to this land. There were many doubts about those convicted, but those in power were so drunk on their power, they would not be stopped. The land itself was covered in the ashes and blood of the people of Trier because of a false narrative pushed by a over-authoritarian fanatic to execute and annihilate the populace. The trials of Trier reignited something that had quieted down. Tell me that it wasn't planned. Because up to this point, from the original witch trials that started in the late 1200s through about the mid 1400s, which we'll go into those next because there were some very specific books that were published at that time. From those trials to now, to this what we're talking about now, things had quieted down. Wasn't so popular, hadn't been talked about much. But thanks to what happened in Trier, this little pamphlet, and there were several of these. This is the clearest one I could find. Let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger for you. This little pamphlet would be published. We'll just do this. And this pamphlet, you can see there's all sorts of evil. There's devils running around. You've got a random priest over here pointing up with a cross. There's a church on this side. But chaos is ensuing. These pamphlets were being published about Trier and being spread all over Europe by the church, by the bishops, by the priests. For what purpose? To reignite the fires of witch trials. Things had quieted down. Things were almost over in the rest of the country. Rest of Europe, basically. This started the fires again. What eventually led to the end of the witch trials in Trier specifically was poverty, to the point where there was no more money to be made. The church owned most of the land at the time. The government owned the rest of it. The people were broke and poor. They were fleeing the land. You have no one to hunt. Who are you going to fearmonger and get to do your dirty deeds? It eventually burned out because they burnt themselves to ashes. There was nothing left to burn. That's what ended the witch trials in Trier. The land itself had been completely destroyed. The people's morale, the people of that area, their belief in any form of beauty and light had been snuffed out. That's not to say they didn't recover it when they left, but this much terror and nightmare, the fear-mongering, not knowing if it was your neighbor or not that caused your baby not to be born, or whatever it was, your crops to fail, they stoked so much fear that these people couldn't, in a healthy way, live there any longer. The witch trials across the board, and we'll wrap this up here, were toxic. They were disastrous. They were nightmares beyond belief. And this madness came to an end because of the breaking point, as I said before. People did start to wake up and push back. Too late, but it happened. Over time, new legislators were put in power, and the church in that day had been restricted significantly, thankfully. They also did this little thing, and I appreciate this, where all executions were taken back under the control of the state. The church had no more authority in this particular area. The legislature of Trier said all executions will be now authorized through the state's approved justice system. There will not be exorbitant prices to executioners. You are paid a base wage, and this is all the more you're getting. No more wealthy executioners. And because of all that happened already, there were no more witches. Funny how that happens. The ground had already been saturated with ashes of those who had been murdered. I will not use another term. That's what had happened. And the people who started it, the Archbishop Johann, Peter Binsfield, the people that they were fans of, got away with it. They got away with the murderers of this many people. Fate does have an entertaining sense of humor because the two most prominent people in the trial, Johann von Schonenberg and Peter Binsfield, died from illnesses that were extremely painful and caused extreme agony. Johann's illness isn't stated specifically. I couldn't find a reference to it anyway. Peter did die of the plague. Wonderful little buboes all over his body. The plague is very painful, very messy, very deadly, especially in that time. Well, but you killed all your doctors, so good luck. That was a down payment to the ride to hell that those two got to go on. These two men of the church unleashed hell on earth, and in return paid for it with their own hell. Word of this mess would spread, as I said earlier, and this would be the spark that set off the next section of hell in Europe. And it wouldn't just be in Europe. Thanks to what happened in 1589 through 1601 or so, the witch trials would spread to the States, United States. And that's going to be something we'll talk about later, but this is what reignited the fervor. Prior to this, everything had been quieted down, and conspiracy theorist in me says this was done on purpose. They purposely conditioned Johann and Peter to gain authority and to put the fear of the witches in people, because the church's authority at this time had started to not so much wane, but it had been relegated more to you deal with the church, we deal with the law. This section of the witch trials reignited the fact that the church had more authority than, in my opinion, they should have. So, there's not really a happy ending except for those two jackwagons died. That's like the happiest ending we got here. Going forward, we'll keep talking about some more of these. These are darker. They're a little bit more intense. If I do decide to go over one specifically to the torture, I'm not sure which platform I'm going to put that on because those get a little graphic. I won't show pictures, trust me. I'll show some images of the devices and describe them. I just don't know if I want to do that just yet. I will be continuing on the occult and crochet stuff to go over the witch trials. And I'm not doing this to trigger fear in anyone or to be like, these are so horrible and sad. I want to bring the fact forward, and I've said this before and I'll keep saying it as long as I feel necessary. I want people to understand that what was being done here had less to do with actual people who practice alternative beliefs, or what we would term today the pagan culture, than it was to do with the church gaining control of everything. And the church back in the day is a lot different than the church today, so don't take offense. Do your history work. That's the big part here. Back in the day, this was a very serious thing, and it was very dangerous. It's this level of authority and insanity is dangerous even today, so that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this kind of stuff needs to be always vigilant for. The witch trials were insidious because they turned neighbor against neighbor under the guise of religious fervor. They were dangerous because people were willing to give up their freedom of thought, reason, and logic because an authority figure, in this case the church, told them that if you didn't do what you were told, you were going to hell. That's not healthy and that's not safe. I'm talking about these things is the modern day Wiccans had to come back out of the broom closet, so to speak. The people who had an alternative belief system to the mainstream literally had to fight to get the laws that were established because of the nonsense we're talking about here were still in effect in the 1900s. Less than 100 years ago, the bills and laws that were put into place during these witch trials were still there. Garbage, completely wrong laws were still on the books and still you could be arrested for. That's why they had to be so careful in the beginning, and then you started getting some loudmouths that were pushing back, which is what you needed. But this stuff is not so far in our history. What I talked about today was 500 years ago. Those laws were still on the books as recent as 1910. This kind of stuff still could be applied today. That's why we need to remember our history, especially our spiritual history. And I'm not going to gloss over it and make it all airy, fairy, and beautiful all the time. A lot of the stuff today is awesome. This was not. So, with that, sorry to be so morose at the end. Not that you would enjoy this, but if you want to hear more about this type of stuff, please hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if this was a little bit informative or if something that you didn't really know was going on at the time. And comment. I would love to hear your opinions, your thoughts, your feelings about these situations. I am going to continue going over them for the foreseeable future. I've got a fairly large list of people to talk about. If there's someone specific that you are interested in, let me know in the comments. And with that, I will let you guys go. Have a great rest of your evening. Hug the people that are closest to you. Let them know how much you care about them. And don't forget, it only takes one fanatic to really cause chaos.